Maid's daughter lost her scholarship for helping injured stranger. Unaware he was Billionaire's son, a janitor's daughter gave up everything she had ever dreamed of for a boy lying unconscious on the cold tile floor, his blood trailing in silent ribbons across the locker room of the school. Completely unaware that the poor scholarship student she thought of as a charity case was, in truth, the hidden son of a billionaire. The silence in the locker room was heavier than the metallic scent of blood that still clung to the air. Words like that might sound like the opening lines of a story belonging to someone else, but for Grace Nolan, they were the moment her life changed forever. That night, the campus of Prescott University lay still beneath the particular chill of a Vermont October. The sky, the color of cold steel, like it had been painted over with frozen ash, and the rain fell steadily, as if the heavens had no plans of stopping. Grace sat on a wooden bench in the hallway of the athletic building, hugging her backpack to her chest. Her thin jacket was no match for the cold, but she had long since grown used to going without. She was waiting for her mother, Karen Nolan, to finish her night shift cleaning the administration wing. Every minute passed slowly, marked only by the tapping of rain against the tall windows and the wind crying down the empty corridor. Prescott was a private university, expensive and dazzling, a world far removed from the tiny apartment she shared with her mother on the south side of town. Grace had earned her place there through a staff family support program, a fragile tether that kept her on the edge of an academic cliff where one wrong step meant the end. She knew every word in the terms of her scholarship. One violation, one complaint from a wealthy student, even one instance of being found in a restricted area could mean expulsion. Her grandfather, Grandpa Joe, a Marine who had fought in Vietnam, used to remind her that holding onto an opportunity was a long battle, one that required discipline in every breath. But that night, every lesson he had ever taught her would be tested. Grace had just lowered her head to review notes for her humanities final when a sharp, metallic crash rang out from the direction of the men's locker room. Her whole body tensed. It was unmistakable. The sound of something heavy and metal hitting the floor, followed by a dull, sickening thud, like a body collapsing. Then, silence. Only the rain. She lifted her head and looked around. The hallway was completely empty. No students nearby, just dim yellow light stretching across the tile floor. She tried to return to her notes, but then came a sound that froze her spine. A moan. Faint, broken, barely audible, not someone fooling around. Someone fighting to breathe. Grace swallowed hard. Her heart began to race. She knew exactly what this meant. The men's locker room was off-limits to female students and staff. Entering was a serious violation. A serious violation meant suspension. Suspension meant losing her scholarship. Losing her scholarship meant her mother would lose her job. Losing both meant the end of everything. Grandpa Joe had told her to keep her head low and her eyes wide open, but he also told her to never leave the wounded behind. Grace stood. One moment of hesitation, one deep breath. Then she pushed open the heavy steel doors and stepped inside. A wave of humid air rolled over her, thick with the smell of sweat, damp towels, and cheap soap. Rows of metal lockers stretched toward the flickering lights at the far end. When her eyes adjusted and found the shape on the ground, her heart sank. A boy lay on his side, one shoulder slumped against the locker, his jersey torn at the seam, blood running from his forehead in a thin stream across the white tile. The long red streaks said he had tried to crawl but didn't get far. Grace ran to him. Her rain-soaked canvas shoes slipped slightly on the floor, but she caught herself and knelt beside him. He was young, maybe a year or two older than she was. His face was pale, lips trembling faintly. His breathing was shallow, each breath sharp and painful. She recognized him, a student everyone whispered about, the one who had just arrived on a scholarship. Nobody really knew anything about him. They called him Prescott's charity case. No family, no money, no name that meant anything. He moved through the campus quietly, always eating alone by the back corner of the library, avoiding eye contact like he wanted to disappear. But this was no rumor. This was a bleeding boy in front of her. Grace placed a hand on his shoulder. "Hey, can you hear me?" No response, just labored, trembling breaths. She looked down at the blood that had begun to pool. Outside, the rain kept falling from the overhang, ticking down the seconds she had left to help him. She whispered to herself what her grandfather had once taught her. You don't leave someone when they're down. Not a brother, not a stranger, no matter what it costs. Grace took a deep breath, slipped off her backpack, unzipped it, and pulled out her thin jacket, rolling it up and tucking it gently under his head. In that moment, she knew with absolute clarity that her future might begin to fall apart from this night forward. But she also knew she could not step over a dying boy on a cold floor, and that was the moment when everything began. Before we continue this story, if you found yourself holding your breath with Grace beneath the rain-soaked skies of that night, take just a moment to subscribe to the YouTube channel Emotional Echoes. Each subscription is like a quiet handshake, a gesture that helps us keep bringing you moving, honest, and deeply human stories every day. If your heart stirred at Grace's brave choice, don't hesitate to click like and share this video with someone who matters to you. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave a comment below and let us know your corner of the world, so we can see just how far Grace and Danny's journey is reaching hearts across the globe. And now, let's return to the next chapter of the story, where the decision of a young woman begins to spark hope in the darkest of hours. The blood spreading across the cold tile beneath the flickering light made the room feel frozen in time. Grace leaned in closer to the boy, straining to hear his breathing over the echoes bouncing off the locker room walls. He was gasping, each breath slicing through his chest like an invisible wound. The thick metallic scent of blood, the damp stench of towels left abandoned on the floor, and the chill of wind slipping through the cracks in the door all mingled into an oppressive, suffocating atmosphere. She adjusted the thin jacket she had folded under his head, trying gently to lift it so the blood would not continue to spill onto the floor, but the fabric was already stained deep red in one corner. It was then that Grace saw it clearly, a long gash above his eyebrow leaking slow, thick drops down the side of his face. She spoke in a whisper, a quiet reassurance. "My name is Grace. I'm going to help you. If you can hear me, try to open your eyes just a little." The boy shifted faintly, his eyelids trembling. A sharp groan of pain escaped his throat, sending a chill down Grace's spine. He tried to move, but the effort only brought more bleeding. "Don't move," Grace said quickly, her voice firm with an instinctive edge, echoing the emergency tone her Grandpa Joe had taught her. "Listen to me. Don't try to move." She scanned the room for anything useful, just musty towels, cold metal lockers, and wooden benches. Nothing clean. She knew this had become a race against time. The gash on his forehead was deeper than she had first realized, but what worried her most was his breathing, harsh, irregular. The kind of breath that hinted at a head injury, maybe worse. His eyes opened, slightly, and for one fleeting second, Grace saw the pale grey beneath the pain. He tried to speak, but his throat caught, and only a faint sound escaped. "Don't talk." Grace laid her hand on his shoulder, her voice low but steady. "You're badly hurt. I'll find a way to get you out of here." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a handkerchief, the one she used to clean her books, clean and dry. Pressing it gently against the wound, she applied steady pressure to slow the bleeding. He winced, his breath catching sharper in his throat, but he didn't pull away. His skin was going cold fast. When she touched his hand, it was ice, and she had to suppress a shiver. Looking down, she saw new streaks of red appearing on the tile. That meant his condition was worsening by the second. She had to act now. But carrying a male student out of the men's locker room at this hour would mean breaking one of the school's strictest rules. Doing that would almost certainly cost her the full scholarship that had kept her family from collapsing. She closed her eyes for a moment, as though listening for a voice inside her. What came instead was the image of Grandpa Joe in his worn Marine uniform, saying words she had grown up hearing. When someone is bleeding in front of you, you do not have the right to look away. You may be the only person they have left. Grace opened her eyes. The decision was already carved deep within her. A small noise made her jump. She tilted her head to listen. Someone was walking past the hallway just beyond the locker room door. The footsteps stopped, then a soft laugh. Someone was close, a group of students maybe, loitering just outside. If they saw her here, with an unconscious boy on the floor, the consequences would come fast and unforgiving. Grace clenched her jaw and leaned forward, shielding him with her body. His breath was growing faster, more uneven. She touched his cheek lightly. "Can you hear me? I need to know your name. I'm Grace. I'm going to get you out of here." He tried again to open his eyes. His lips quivered, forming something broken, barely audible. "Danny." Grace leaned in closer to catch it. "Your name is Danny." He blinked once as if to confirm, then faded again into a haze. Grace placed her hand on his chest to feel his breathing. Shallow and weak, a sign of trauma or internal bleeding. There was no time left to weigh the risks. The footsteps outside were growing louder. She knew they could belong to one of the rich kids from Prescott. The kind who could turn her entire life in a darker direction with a single sentence. But behind her lay a boy bleeding on the floor. A boy who no longer had the strength to save himself. She swallowed hard, drew in a deep breath, and whispered to Danny, "I'm getting you out of here, no matter what happens to me." Then she slipped one arm beneath his back, the other around his shoulders, and began to lift him. Danny groaned as his chest rose, the pain pushing against every inch of movement. Grace gritted her teeth, gathering all the strength in her body to hold him up. The cold air from the door crack cut across her skin, making her shiver but also sharpening her focus. She wasn't thinking about the scholarship anymore, not about Dean Sullivan or the rules that had hovered over her for the past 3 years like a storm cloud. There was only Danny, the blood on the floor, and a choice that offered no turning back. She tightened her grip and whispered, not to him, but to herself, "I won't walk past. Not tonight. Not when you need me like this." Then she pulled Danny against her shoulder and forced herself to stand, knowing full well this moment was the doorway to a life entirely unlike the one she had known. Danny was heavier than Grace had expected. His frame, though thin and drained of life, still bore a weight that pressed hard against her shoulders. With every step, Grace felt as though she were pushing back against an entire world she had never truly belonged to. A world where every move was measured through the lens of status, rules, and power. Her shirt was soaked with blood, clinging to her skin, cold enough to sting. But she didn't stop. She had to get him out. He was bleeding, and every minute that passed could be the narrow edge between life and death. Grace knew exactly what she was violating. Prescott University's regulations stated in no uncertain terms that female students were not permitted inside the men's locker room. Any breach of that rule meant immediate suspension. If she were found helping an unconscious male student out of that forbidden space, she wouldn't just be breaking a rule. She would be walking straight into a storm of assumptions. The kind people like her, the daughter of a janitor, never had the protection to weather. But she had no choice. She couldn't leave Danny behind. In her mind, Grandpa Joe's voice rose again, steady and disciplined, as if he were right beside her. "When you see blood, you don't fear it. You handle it. You take control of the situation." She guided Danny toward the door, pausing to listen for any sound beyond it. The hallway was silent, except for the rain tapping against the glass roof above, a steady rhythm like a clock counting down. She eased the steel door open, glanced quickly into the corridor, and pulled Danny closer to her side. Now, every movement had to be precise. She had to get him to her mother's car. She had no idea how, but she would find a way. In the dim light, she saw a single drop of blood slide from Danny's temple down to the collar of his shirt. She needed to check his wound again. Right there in the empty hallway, Grace gently lowered Danny to sit against the wall. She knelt beside him, pulled out the clean handkerchief from her backpack, and opened the small first aid kit she had carried since high school. Grandpa Joe had started teaching her emergency response when she was 12, making her practice every week. When she complained, he said only one thing: when someone is dying next to you, you don't have time to learn. You have to already know. She unwrapped a fresh bandage, removed the makeshift cloth from Danny's forehead, and assessed the damage. The gash was nearly 7 centimeters long, edges swollen and red, with blood still seeping slowly, though less than before. She dabbed the area clean with sterile gauze, gently rinsed it with antiseptic, then pressed a fresh pad tightly against it. Danny groaned softly, but didn't wake. His breathing remained shallow, his skin cold. She shone a small penlight from her keychain into his eyes. One of them fluttered open, then closed again, almost instantly. His pupils reacted sluggishly, a subtle but troubling sign of a concussion. Grace tilted his head to one side so the blood wouldn't pool down his neck, then secured the bandage in place. Once she had done all she could, she slipped her arm under his back again, lifted him to his feet, and braced his weight against her. Her muscles screamed with the strain, her hands raw and burning from holding him steady, but she bit down hard and focused on each step forward. At the end of the hall stood the back exit of the athletic center, where her mother always parked at night. If she was lucky, her mom had already finished cleaning the admin wing and was waiting in the car. If not, Grace would have to manage alone, out in the cold rain, with someone badly injured in her arms. As she neared the exit, Danny suddenly murmured something. "They left me." His voice was hoarse and broken. Grace stopped, gripping his shoulder to keep him steady. Who did this to you?" Danny didn't answer. He only shook his head faintly and closed his eyes. Blood had soaked through the hem of his shirt. It wasn't just the head wound. There might be broken ribs, maybe internal bleeding. If he didn't get to a hospital soon, she would lose him. She pushed open the back door. A gust of wind swept in, carrying the smell of wet earth and distant smoke from a nearby factory. Beneath the hazy streetlight, she saw her mother's old station wagon parked at the curb, headlights still on. Grace shouted through the rain, "Mom, help me." The car door flung open and Karen Nolan ran toward her, eyes wide with shock as she saw the blood covering her daughter's clothes. "My God. Grace, what happened? Who is he? No time to explain. He needs a hospital now. I stopped the bleeding, but there might be more." Grace's voice trembled, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline surging through her veins. Her mother didn't ask another question. Together they helped Danny into the back seat. Grace climbed in after him, cradling his head in her lap with a dry towel. Her mother hit the gas. The tires squealed as the car tore down the road, cutting through the storm and the dark toward the nearest hospital. In the back seat, Grace held Danny's hand tightly, pressing her cheek to his forehead to check his temperature, whispering constantly, "Don't fall asleep. Keep your eyes open. My name's Grace. I'm here. You're going to be okay." In that moment, she was no longer a student or a janitor's daughter. She was the last barrier between a life slipping away and a world that could still hold on. And she wasn't going to let him fall. Not tonight. Not while there was still something she could do. The rain still pounded against the windshield like a relentless drumbeat, urging them forward with every strike. The old station wagon rolled through the deserted streets of the sleeping Vermont town, streetlights blurring into streaks across the wet pavement. Inside the car, Grace held Danny's head in her lap, one hand pressing the gauze firmly against his wound, the other wrapped around his wrist, feeling for the weak, fading rhythm of his pulse. Every time the car hit a pothole, Danny let out a faint groan. From the driver's seat, Karen Nolan glanced at her daughter. Through the rear-view mirror, her face drawn tight with worry. She asked no questions, offered no judgment, only gripped the steering wheel as if willing her hands alone could hold the boy's life together until they reached the hospital. When they finally turned into the drive leading to St. Mary's, Grace lifted her head, swallowing the dizzying tension that gripped her chest like a vice. She knew this place. Every hallway, every sound in the emergency room. It was here that Grandpa Joe had come and gone during his final year. The moment the car stopped, Grace threw the door open and shouted for help. A young nurse rushed outside, pushing a gurney. Danny was lifted out with care, Grace never more than a step behind. She followed him until the emergency room doors shut tight, sealing him inside. Only then did she allow her knees to give way, sinking into one of the cold plastic chairs in the hallway. She didn't know how much time had passed. The rain had stopped. The night had stilled. Her mother sat beside her without a word. They waited together, but the silence would not last. Suddenly, the doors to the ER swung open, and 3 figures stepped in, shifting the air around them like a storm. Leading them was Brad Sullivan, the dean's son, hands in his pockets, wearing the same smug look he always wore, as though every room he entered already belonged to him. 2 others flanked him, both in Prescott's football jackets, their eyes sweeping past Grace as if she were no more than furniture in their path. Brad stopped in front of her, his gaze flicking to the blood still staining her clothes, still playing the hero. "Huh, Nolan. Thought you'd have learned how the game works at Prescott by now." Grace stood, keeping her voice calm. He was badly hurt. He might have died if no one helped him. Brad's smirk widened. "That's the problem. No one cares if he lives or dies. He's not one of us. He's just trashed the school let in to make the brochures look nice." Grace took a step forward, locking eyes with him. "So what? You think people like me are trash too?" Brad chuckled softly, leaning in. "I think if you don't get out of Prescott on your own, you'll be thrown out before you even realize what happened. And I won't have to lift a finger. You brought it on yourself." Grace didn't flinch. "I don't care who's rich or who's not. I care that someone was bleeding on the floor and no one else lifted a hand to help. No one but me. You can threaten me. You can tell your father. But I don't regret what I did." Brad's expression hardened, his voice dropping to a growl. "You think this makes you noble. You think you've done something that matters. You didn't save him. All you did was sign the termination notice for your mum's job. You're going to lose your scholarship. And all because you were too stupid to understand the rules exist to protect people like me, not people like you." Grace felt the fury rise, hot and fast in her chest. But she didn't raise her voice. Instead, she lowered it, steady and unwavering. "If my mum loses her job because I saved someone who was bleeding to death, then at least I'll know I didn't walk past him like the rest of you did. And if Prescott throws me out for that, then it's not a school I want to belong to." A heavy pause settled over them. Brad stared at her, and for the first time, something flickered behind his eyes, hesitation, or maybe something closer to doubt. But it vanished as quickly as it came. He turned and walked away. His friends followed. The door shut behind them with a soft, definitive thud. Only then did Grace realize her legs were shaking. She sat down again, staring at her hands, still stained with blood. Her mother reached over and took her hand, gave it a gentle squeeze. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you. Even if we have to pack our things tomorrow, at least we didn't turn our backs." Grace leaned into her mother's shoulder, and a single tear slipped down her cheek, not out of fear, but from the deep, aching certainty that for the first time in her life she had stood up for what was right, even if it meant standing against the entire world. The morning sun filtered weakly through the thin curtains of the small third-floor apartment tucked in the aging building on the south side of town. Grace woke with her eyes burning, throat dry, and a heaviness still pressed deep against her chest like the lingering weight of a night spent entirely awake. She stepped out of her room and found her mother sitting quietly at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee, her eyes fixed on the dim screen of an old phone. There was no good morning. No scent of fried eggs or toast like there used to be. Only silence. Grace approached slowly. Her mother looked up, and in her eyes was something Grace could hardly bear, an ache carved from equal parts heartbreak and defeat. "They called," her mother said, voice rough as sandpaper. "The school's HR office. Said, I don't need to come back. No meeting, no explanation, just a call. 30 seconds, maybe less." Grace sat down across from her, trying to stay calm. "Mom, this is my fault. I went into the restricted area. I made everything worse. But if I had to do it again, I wouldn't change a thing." Her mother set the cup down, both hands trembling slightly. "I know. I'm not angry with you. I'm just trying to figure out how to live with $80 in the bank and the power bill due Wednesday. They won't pay me for this month. I was let go before payroll closed, and the lease is up at the end of the month." Grace swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She wanted to say she'd take every shift she could at the diner, go back to washing tables and mopping floors every night. But she also knew the truth. No amount of late-night work would ever be enough to pay for tuition at Prescott without the scholarship. And the blow came, sooner than she expected. At 8 a.m., an email from the academic office landed in her inbox. The subject line struck like a blade. Notice of suspension. In the message, they wrote that she had committed a serious violation of campus policy, unauthorized entry into a restricted area, disruption of facility use, and breach of student conduct. Her scholarship was officially suspended. Her return to campus would depend on the outcome of a disciplinary hearing next week. But Grace already knew what that meant. The word suspension wasn't a pause. It was a closed door. Prescott didn't trade in uncertainty. She turned off her phone and set it on the table. Then she sat still, unmoving. That was it. All the years of studying late into the night, all the exam prep in library corners, all the evenings spent bussing tables to help with rent gone. All of it lost because she hadn't been able to walk past someone bleeding on the ground. She knew what she'd done was right. She knew it in her bones. But the board didn't care about right or wrong. They cared about silence, about image, about preserving a fragile, polished order that stayed intact only by snuffing out anything that dared fall outside its frame. Karen stood and opened the fridge. Inside, there was a bit of milk, half a loaf of bread, and a few eggs going bad. She closed the door without taking anything. Her voice came low and flat. "You weren't wrong. But the people who are right usually pay a higher price than the ones who aren't." She turned back to her daughter. "Maybe I was wrong to let you believe being good was enough to get you through." Grace said nothing. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her mother from behind. Karen flinched slightly at first, but then folded her hands over her daughter's. In that silence, they knew they weren't alone. They were simply being pushed to the edges of a world built on rules written by those with the luxury of rewriting them. And yet, what Grace couldn't stop thinking about, what kept thudding in the back of her mind, was Danny. Where was he now? Did he survive? Did he understand what she had given up for him? Or would he disappear, leaving her to carry the consequences alone? She had no answers. Only the widening hollow inside her chest, a nameless fear that perhaps all the good she had believed in wasn't enough to stand against the weight of the world. And still, even with all of that bearing down on her, she did not regret what she had done. And for now, that was the only thing she had left to hold on to. 3 days later, Grace returned to St. Mary's Hospital, wearing her old dark coat and sneakers soaked through from the steady autumn rain. The Vermont air no longer held the biting cold of that terrible night, but inside her the chill was heavier than ever, weighing down every step as if her heart had turned to stone. She walked through the main lobby, steadying her voice as she asked the front desk about a patient named Danny. The nurse searched for a long moment, then shook her head. No one by that name was currently being treated here. Grace frowned, nodded her thanks, and made her way to the emergency ward where she had sat for hours, waiting for news the night Danny was brought in. An older doctor recognized her, greeted her with a nod, and asked her to wait. After checking the records, he returned and spoke with gentle, careful words. He was discharged yesterday morning. Left on his own request. Are you sure that's the patient you're looking for? Grace nodded. Yes. Did he say anything? Leave a number? An address? The doctor shook his head. Nothing at all. We were surprised too. His injuries weren't fully healed, but he signed himself out and left with a man. Older. Looked like family. Grace stood there for several seconds, unmoving, as if something essential had slipped from her grasp. Danny was gone. No message, no thank you, no explanation, just vanished, as though none of it had ever happened. On the walk home, the wind slapped at her face in sharp gusts, rain clinging to her hair and sliding cold against her neck, but she felt none of it. Her mind held only the image of Danny that night, crumpled on the locker room floor, his voice a breath in the dark saying her name. She had risked everything for him, and now he had disappeared like a ghost. That afternoon she returned to the campus library to submit a petition for scholarship reconsideration. The library was nearly empty, students scattered in quiet corners preparing for midterms. As she passed the hallway bulletin board, her eyes landed on a newly posted notice. The Nolan Scholarship was officially revoked. In its place, a new award for an incoming freshman had been announced, backed by an anonymous donor. She stared at the paper, its wording hastily printed, clinical, impersonal. It felt like someone had taken a black pen and drawn a single cold line through her. Name. Grace turned away, swallowing the knot rising in her throat. When she returned to the apartment, her mother was folding clothes into small piles, preparing for the move to a cheaper rental on the outskirts of town. Karen said nothing when Grace walked in. She simply handed her a small piece of paper folded into quarters. This came this morning, no name on the envelope. Grace opened it, her pulse quickening. A short message, handwritten, stopped her breath cold. Thank you for not leaving me. I owe you my life. I hope one day I can repay it. No signature, no return address, no clue. But the handwriting, neat, with a subtle tilt in the G of Grace, was unmistakable. It was Danny. She folded the note and held it tight in her hand, as if letting go might cause it to vanish too. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing for a long time. A part of her wanted to be angry, wanted to curse Danny for his silence, for leaving her and her mother to carry the fallout, alone. But another part understood. Maybe he hadn't had a choice either. He wasn't like the others at Prescott. He had moved like a shadow across campus, no friends, no backstory, no trace. He had carried a secret the school didn't want to acknowledge, and now that secret had pulled him away once more, leaving behind only the quiet cost of her and her mother's sacrifice. That night, Grace stepped onto the small balcony. Wind pushed through the cracks in the old bricks, and the sickly yellow glow from a nearby street lamp stretched long across the cracked wall beside her. She sat down, staring out at the soft grey of the sky. There were no tears left, only a vague, heavy emptiness. She had done the right thing, she knew that. But the price of doing right, it seemed, was silence, loss, and the echoing sense of being left behind. Sometimes the pain doesn't come from what you lose, but from the fact that the person you once saved never found the strength to stay. No. Goodbye. No final look, just a single note. and a space inside her that might never be filled again. 3 days later, just when Grace had almost made peace with the idea that every door had been shut, the phone rang, slicing through the quiet of a fragile afternoon like a blade through paper. She was packing old books into cardboard boxes, her fingers still dusty, when her mother stepped out of the kitchen holding the landline receiver, her face unreadable. "It's for you," she said. "From the office of the board chairman." Grace froze. She wiped her hands on her jeans and took the receiver, heart thudding. On the other end, a man's voice spoke, low, calm, and carrying the unmistakable gravity of someone who had spent a lifetime making decisions. "Is this Grace Nolan?" "Yes, sir. Can you come to the president's office tomorrow morning? There's a matter we need to discuss in person." "Yes, of course. I'll be there." The call ended as quickly as it had begun. No explanation, no room for questions. Grace set the phone down, her pulse racing. She looked at her mother, who could only shrug, equally unsure. But for the first time in days, a flicker of something sparked in Grace's eyes, the faintest glimmer of hope. The next morning, she dressed in the plainest white shirt she owned, the last one without a tear or stain. She tied her hair back and walked to campus with the quiet determination of someone ready to face whatever needed to be faced, even if it meant hearing, once and for all, that her time at Prescott had truly ended. The main hallway of the administrative building was washed in pale winter sunlight. Portraits of past presidents lined the walls, watching her pass with their unmoving, dignified stares. When she entered the office, President Mitchell stood near a woman she didn't recognize, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, wearing thin wire glasses. "Miss Nolan, please have a seat." President Mitchell gestured to a wooden chair across the desk. Grace sat, her heart pounding like a drum against her ribs. The woman gave a small, polite smile. "I'm Helen Graves, secretary to the chairman of the board. I'm here on his behalf to deliver some recent decisions. You were suspended last week for a policy violation. That much was handled by protocol. However, after a thorough review, we believe that certain key factors were not fully considered in the original report." Grace didn't speak, her hands clenched in her lap. Helen continued, her tone steady, but her eyes softer now. "Specifically, your actions that night saved another student's life. Though it occurred after hours and in a restricted area, your quick thinking and bravery have been noted. After consultation with the Ethics Committee and Legal Counsel, the chairman has approved full reinstatement of your scholarship, effective next week." Grace blinked, stunned. She wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. I can come back? I can keep my scholarship? President?" Mitchell nodded. For the first time in 3 years, he smiled, not politely, but truly. "More than that, your mother, Mrs. Karen Nolan, will be reinstated to her position. But not as a janitor. She's being offered a new role as administrative coordinator for the facilities wing, with better pay and benefits." Grace turned to Helen, unable to hide her disbelief. "But why? Why the sudden change? Who did this?" Helen gave a faint smile, then opened a folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Everything was initiated under the chairman's directive. But the truth is, someone spoke up, someone influential. They provided new information and raised concerns about the fairness of how your case was handled. That prompted an emergency review." Grace sat still, the morning light around her suddenly too bright to see through. She didn't know who it was. But deep inside, one name rang clear. Danny. He hadn't said goodbye. But he hadn't disappeared either. She took a breath, steadying the emotion rising in her throat, and looked at the two people before her. "Thank you. Thank you for giving me the chance to return and for giving my mother a fresh start." Helen stood and extended a hand. "No, you earned that yourself. All we did was correct what never should have been wrong." As Grace stepped out of the office, sunlight hit her face, cold, clean and clear. She stood in the middle of the Prescott campus, a place that had once made her feel so small, now somehow different. Not because it had become easier, but because, for the first time, she knew someone had stood up for her. And though she didn't know for certain who that person was, she knew one thing without doubt. Her story wasn't over, and the next chapter had just begun. News of Grace's reinstated scholarship spread quickly across campus, but what stirred more whispers and stolen glances was a notice pinned to the main board outside the financial aid office. A new scholarship fund had been established, specifically for first-year students with financial hardship and exceptional academic promise. The name of the fund wasn't tied to any familiar foundation or large corporation. It was simply titled, "The Anonymous Benefactor Fund." The words were plain, the font unadorned, but there was something about them, some quiet gravity, that seemed to pull Grace's eyes toward the paper each time she passed by. She read it again and again, a rising sense of recognition pressing gently against her chest. There was something in the phrasing, in the way silence itself seemed embedded in the generosity, that made her think of Danny. Not because she was certain, but because no one else had entered her life so suddenly, so deeply, and then vanished without a trace like he had. Since returning to Prescott, Grace had been living in two parallel realities. One was rooted in the steady rhythm of her restored schedule, her mother's new position, a fragile, the sense of normalcy returning piece by piece. The other was shaped by an absence, a silence. Danny's. He wasn't in any of her classes. No one mentioned him. It was as if he'd never existed in Prescott's records at all. She had searched quietly through student rosters, campus clubs, even the blood donor registry at St. Mary's. Nothing. It was like chasing a ghost through a maze of closed doors. Then, one late afternoon, as she left the library under a pale grey sky, a passing conversation stopped her in her tracks. Two upperclassmen were leaning near a vending machine. One of them spoke in a hushed, intrigued voice. Heard the new scholarship fund came from one of the school's most private donors. The other tilted his head. "Who?" The first student glanced around before replying. "They just call him Whitmore, but no one's ever seen him." Grace froze. That name. She remembered it, faint and broken, from the hospital room where Danny had murmured a few scattered words. One of them was Whitmore. At the time, she had thought it was just the name of a friend or a relative. Now, it slid perfectly into place, like a final puzzle piece she hadn't known was missing. That evening, she told her mother everything. Karen sat quietly for a long time, then pulled out the folded note Danny had left behind. Her voice was thoughtful, almost wondering. Maybe he wasn't just thanking you. Maybe he was trying to fix everything that had been taken from us. Grace nodded slowly, the thought sinking deeper. If it was Danny, then what he had done was more than an act of repayment. It was a correction, a quiet reshaping of what had broken, not with noise, not with credit, but with intention. Just like the way he had whispered her name that night in the dark, barely enough for her to hear, but enough to keep her moving. There was no proof, no clear confirmation. But in Grace's heart, the truth was becoming undeniable. Danny had not disappeared. He had simply stepped back, slipping into the shadows that had always surrounded him, but still watching, still there, still choosing to believe that what she had done mattered. That night, Grace sat at her desk and wrote a letter. Not to be sent, not for anyone's eyes but her own. She wrote about everything from the rain-drenched night in the locker room to the quiet, restored days that followed. She wrote with a mix of fierce gratitude and soft resentment for a boy who had forced her to stand in a storm, and then, without a word, helped her back up when she thought she had fallen for good. When she was done, she folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer, unaddressed. Sometimes the things we need to say aren't meant to be read by others. They're meant to remind us of who we are and how far we've come. And Grace knew now whether or not Danny ever returned to her life. She was no longer the girl who had once sat huddled on a crumbling balcony, her eyes blurred by rain, tears. She was someone who had stood in the eye of the storm, who had paid the price for choosing what was right, who had learned that kindness might leave scars, but it was also the only force capable of opening doors that neither brilliance nor privilege could touch. Before bed, she placed Danny's note beside the letter she had written. 2 slips of paper, 2 lives crossing for only a breath of time, but just enough to change everything. And though the name Whitmore remained an unanswered question, deep in her heart, the answer had never been clearer. Monday morning arrived with a strange electricity in the air, and from the moment the first light touched the grounds of Prescott, something about the campus felt different. The usual quiet of the week's beginning was replaced by a hum of restless curiosity. Groups of students gathered near the main gate, drawn like moths to a scene that didn't belong to any ordinary school day. Lined up in front of the entrance was a convoy of sleek, jet-black SUVs, their engines purring with the quiet confidence of something expensive and important. The vehicles shimmered with the sheen of recent rain and bore silver emblems on their tinted windows. A stylized W encased in a circle, minimalist yet unmistakably powerful. They looked less like they belonged to a school visitor and more like they had just rolled out from an international summit. Students clustered closer, pulling out their phones, murmuring questions to one another in breathless speculation. Some from the economics department guessed it was the arrival of a corporate delegation. A few professors, already on campus early, stood straighter, nodding politely at the figures stepping out of the cars, the way one greets heads of state. Grace wasn't among the crowd. She was in ethics, her notes neat and steady across the page when her phone vibrated silently. A message from Sarah, her roommate, popped up with just 3 words: "You need to see this." Frowning, Grace glanced out the second-story window. From her vantage point, she could see the top edges of the black vehicles and the growing semicircle of students below. Her heart skipped. She raised her hand, asked quietly to be excused, and headed down the stairwell, her palms damp and cold with something she didn't yet name. When she reached the crowd, students parted around her, as if drawn back by some invisible thread. All attention had fixed on a figure stepping from the center SUV. A young man in a crisp white shirt beneath a tailored black coat. No flashy logos, no security details. And yet his presence seemed to command the entire courtyard. He walked with a calm steadiness that made people instinctively move aside, his gaze focused, his posture effortless. No one recognized him. But Grace did. She knew him the moment she saw those grey eyes, cool and unreadable, carrying both gravity and something else, something hidden and quietly, wounded beneath the surface. His hair was shorter now, his face stronger, no longer pale or fragile. But it was him, Danny. Only now, he wasn't Danny. As the school's president hurried forward to greet him, Grace heard the words that turned her world on its head. "This is Michael Whitmore, representing the Whitmore Educational Development Fund." Grace felt the breath leave her body. Whitmore, the name that had appeared on official letters, on anonymous donations, whispered in halls and pinned on announcements. The name she had whispered to herself in sleepless hours, unsure if it was real or imagined. It wasn't just a name, it was the answer, and now it had a face. She took a step back, slipping behind a group of students, her heartbeat loud in her ears. How could he stand there like nothing had happened? As though there had never been blood on the locker room floor, never a moment when death was closer than life. As he moved toward the school, administrators, his eyes swept across the crowd and stopped. Right on her. They locked eyes, and for a moment, everything else faded. No noise, no wind, no curious whispers. Just the two of them, standing in the eye of a storm they had created together. There was no shock in his expression, no surprise, just recognition, acceptance, a silent admission, I know. And I see you. Before she could move, a tall, lean man in a grey suit stepped forward. He shook hands with the president, nodded to faculty, and placed a steady hand on Michael's shoulder. His voice was low, authoritative. "This," he said, "is the sole heir of Whitmore Global. Michael will be touring the campus with us today as we prepare for a long-term partnership to expand national scholarship programs." Applause rippled through the courtyard. Students gasped, whispering behind cupped hands. Some stared in awe at the revelation that the quiet, poised young man was the heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire. Others fixated on his calm demeanor, his quiet elegance. But Grace remained still. She didn't feel anger, not quite. Not anymore. What rose in her chest now was more complicated. Shock, confusion, a dull ache from wounds not fully closed. He had returned, but as someone new. Someone with a different name, a different past, and perhaps a reason for disappearing that she couldn't yet see. Danny Whitmore. Michael. Whatever his name is now, he's back. But he had returned with silence, and secrets, and a power that now stood out in the open for all to see. Grace didn't move. She didn't chase. Not yet. But her gaze never left him, because what she knew now, without a doubt, was this. Their story wasn't finished, and all the pieces she thought she had left behind were beginning to return, one by one, clearer than ever. Whatever came next, it was already in motion. That afternoon, while the entire campus still buzzed with murmurs about the shocking arrival of the heir to the Whitmore Empire, Grace sat motionless on the third floor of the library, in the quietest reading room tucked beneath the eaves. Before her lay an open book, pages splayed wide, but for nearly 20 minutes she hadn't read a single line. All she could see was Danny's eyes. No, Michael's meeting hers across the crowded courtyard that morning. That single look, fleeting yet filled with more meaning than words could carry. It hadn't been the glance of a stranger. It had been recognition, regret, and a silent, desperate plea. But wrapped in that gaze had been a name, Michael Whitmore, that ripped through everything she had come to believe. A name that should have been spoken from the beginning, a truth she should have been told. As the last of the daylight stretched long and golden through the high library windows, Grace stood, shoved her book into her bag, and walked out. She didn't know exactly where she was going, only that if she didn't face him, now, if she didn't look him in the eye and demand the truth, she would never move forward. She found him in the quiet garden behind the main auditorium, a place rarely visited, especially this late in the day. Danny Michael was seated on a wooden bench, a paper coffee cup warming his hands. She didn't call his name. She simply stopped and looked at him. He looked up. Their eyes met again, this time without a crowd, without cameras, without applause. Just two people who had once shared a night that neither of them could forget, now standing on opposite ends of a lie that had stretched too long. Grace walked closer. Her voice, when it came, was rough from holding back. "Can you tell me now, who did I save that night? And why lie to me when you were dying?" Danny set the cup down and stood. "I didn't lie, Grace. Not entirely. My full name is Michael Daniel Whitmore. Before my mother passed away, she was the only one who called me Danny. When I'm hurt or afraid, that's who I am. That night on the floor, I wasn't the heir to a billion-dollar empire. I was just Danny. And you were the only one who answered him. He no longer looked like the frail boy who had bled across the locker room floor. There was something steadier in his posture, wearier in his eyes. You saved me," he he said softly. The person who couldn't stand on his own. The one you didn't walk past. But you lied to me, Grace said, every word shaking loose from the tight place in her chest. About your name, about everything. You let me think you were just some forgotten kid, someone no one cared about. You let me lose my scholarship. You let my mom lose her job. And then you vanished, like none of it ever happened. I didn't have a choice, he said quietly. I didn't want anyone to know who I was. Prescott was the one place I thought I could live outside the shadow of my family. My father didn't want me here, not as a normal student. I came back under another name, just to feel real for once. You were the only one who saw me. Not my name, not my money. Just me. Grace shook her head. But you left me alone with the consequences. I needed something. A thank you. An explanation. Anything. Not just a nameless note and silence. I wrote that note all night, he said, voice low. I wanted to come back. I nearly did. But I was scared. Not of you. I was scared that if I came back as Michael Whitmore, you wouldn't believe any of it had been real. And I didn't want to lose what we had in those moments. She was silent then. The words he offered cut deep, carving through everything she had trusted. She looked at him for a long time, then asked, So why come back now? To save the school? Or to save your conscience? He didn't look away. Because I still owe you, not just for my life, for the truth, and I'm tired of hiding from it. Grace said nothing more. She took one step back, turned, and walked away. Not out of anger this time, but because she needed space, needed time. Even the most honest confession couldn't instantly mend what was broken by deceit. But now, at least, the lie was no longer growing in the dark. And that mattered. She heard his voice behind her, barely above a whisper. Thank you. Thank you for not walking past. Grace didn't turn back. But something inside her, tight and bruised, began to loosen. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something gentler, a beginning. And sometimes that's all a wounded heart needs to remember how to heal. 2 days after that quiet but searing conversation in the garden behind the auditorium, Grace received a phone call that caught her completely off guard. The voice on the line belonged to Mr. Whitmore's assistant, speaking with polite restraint but unmistakable certainty. He extended an invitation. Dinner at a local restaurant that evening, hosted by Mr. Martin Whitmore, himself with his son, Michael, at his side. There was no explanation, no pressure, just a formal request framed in words that left no room for confusion. Grace hesitated. Most of her wanted to say no. She didn't need a dinner to smooth things over or a polished apology crafted in a boardroom. But something else, something small, stubborn, born of curiosity and principle, made her say yes. If this man had shaped what happened at Prescott, if he was the reason Danny had lived 2 lives and hidden one of them behind silence, then she needed to see him for herself. That evening, she walked into Le Fleur, the most elegant restaurant in town, known for its soft lighting and the steady hush of a piano playing somewhere in the background like a heartbeat untouched by time. She wore a simple blue dress borrowed from her roommate, her hair pulled back, no makeup except a bit of color on her lips. She wanted to walk in as herself, no pretense, no mask. The host guided her to a table by the window overlooking the darkened river. Martin Whitmore was already seated, dressed in a flawlessly tailored grey suit, his silver hair combed with purpose. Beside him was Danny Michael in a pale blue shirt, no tie. He stood the moment he saw her, pulled out her chair without a word. His father greeted her with a nod, his expression unreadable. Dinner began in silence. Wine was poured, plates arrived. No one spoke until the hush between them stretched thin enough to snap. It was Martin who finally broke it. "I've heard a lot about you, Grace," he said. "From reports, from faculty, and recently from my son." Grace held his gaze, steady and calm. "Sir, I'm not sure what you've heard is all accurate, but I can say one thing. I never intended to hurt your son, if that's what you think." Martin's mouth curved slightly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I don't think you've hurt anyone. But I do want to understand. A young woman with nothing but a scholarship and a fragile future risked it all to save a stranger. Why?" Grace set down her fork. "Because I was raised that way. My grandfather was a Marine. He used to say, if you see someone in need, you don't turn away. If you do, you lose more than the chance to save a life. You lose a part of your own humanity." Martin was quiet. His gaze dropped for the first time, and for a brief moment, something older than pride flickered in his expression. He refilled his glass slowly before speaking again, voice low and even. "My son didn't tell you who he was because he didn't want to be seen as a Whitmore. He wanted to find out who he was without the weight of that name. You were the only person who ever looked at him without judgment, without assumptions," Grace replied without hesitation. "Then I did the right thing. But if he truly trusted me, he shouldn't have kept it from me for so long." Martin nodded. "You're right. But when you grow up carrying a name like ours, silence becomes survival. It's the only way you learn to live honestly, even if it means living in secret." Danny hadn't spoken, but his eyes never left the table. He listened to them both, quietly absorbing every word, hands wrapped around his water glass like it anchored him in the moment. Martin refilled his glass slowly before speaking again. "I did some research on your grandfather, Grace. Joe Nolan, a Silver Star and a Purple Heart recipient. Records say he sold his medals 20 years ago to pay for a family emergency." Grace looked down, her voice quiet. "Yes, he sold them to pay for my mother's surgery. He said honor isn't in the metal, it's in the blood." Martin looked at her with a profound, newfound respect. He nodded slowly. A man of rare character, and clearly he passed that on. "I've kept it not for value, but meaning. After hearing what your grandfather meant to you, I believe it belongs somewhere more rightful." Grace opened the box. Inside was a military medal, aged with time, a silver star, darkened at the edges. Her breath caught. "This," she whispered, "this is a military decoration." Martin's voice softened. "It's an original Purple Heart. One your grandfather was awarded decades ago. I don't know why he had to sell it. But if you'd like, it can go home again." Grace stared at it for a long moment, then gently closed the box and rested her hands on top. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But I don't need that to remember what he taught me. That's in my blood." For the first time that evening, Martin smiled, and this time it was real. "Then I have nothing to worry about when it comes to my son. He's found the right person." As Grace stepped out into the cool evening air, she wasn't sure whether that final line was meant as metaphor or something more. She only knew this: her life was changing, and it had begun with a wound, an overdue truth, and a dinner unlike any she had ever known. On the walk home from dinner, Grace kept the small leather box pressed close inside her coat pocket, holding it not for its weight, but for the invisible thread it represented, still linking her to a part of her past she had never let go of. She didn't open it again. She didn't need to. The medal inside wasn't just an award for bravery. It was a quiet witness to a life lived with quiet integrity, a life like her grandfather's. When she stepped into the small apartment, she placed the box on the wooden table in their modest living room, right beside the old black-and-white photo of her grandfather in uniform. His eyes in that picture were as they always had been, strong, steady, kind. Her mother, still in the kitchen preparing a late supper, turned at the sound of the door and looked up with a mix of surprise and anticipation. "They took you to that restaurant?" she asked, half whispering, as if Saying the name of Lafleur aloud might change something. What was he like? Grace didn't answer right away. She walked to the table, sat down, and slowly opened the box. Her mother came closer and froze when she saw what lay inside. Her hand instinctively moved to her chest, as if to steady a heart suddenly struck with too much memory. "Oh, my God! I thought it was gone," she breathed. Grace nodded. Mr. Whitmore gave it back. He said it was part of his personal collection, not for its price, but for its meaning. Her mother sat beside her, the two of them staring at the worn silver star resting on its velvet bed, small, tarnished, but radiant with something that had nothing to do with shine. Grace told her everything. About the dinner, about Martin Whitmore's probing questions, about the flicker of warmth in his eyes that surfaced only once, right at the end. But what lingered most in her was not the generosity, or even the gesture itself, but the contradiction. This was the man who had once controlled Danny's world, who had asked him to erase his name, suppress his identity, to protect the image of an empire. And now, that same man had handed Grace the most sacred item in his collection, placing it before her not as a bribe, not as restitution, but almost as recognition. Grace wasn't sure if it was redemption or something more complicated, but she knew that, for a few quiet minutes at that table, the distance between Billionaire and janitor's daughter had vanished. There had been no legacy to protect, no debts to settle, just three people, bound by a story none of them had expected to share. Her mother brushed her fingers over the leather box gently, her voice trembling. "He sold it. Your grandfather. When I got sick. We didn't have insurance back then. He never told me. Just said, honors don't live in medals, they live in what you do after." Grace took her hand. "Maybe it's come back now because we needed the reminder. Not to honor him, but to remember that nothing we did was meaningless." The next morning, Grace placed the box on her desk, right beside her lamp. She didn't tuck it away in a drawer. She wanted to see it, every day. To remind herself that goodness quiet, often thankless, sometimes costly, still left traces. Sometimes it had to circle back through distance, pain, and doubt before finding its way home. But it always did. Later that week, an envelope arrived from the Prescott University Board of Trustees. Unlike the last letter she'd received from them, this one bore no warnings, no disciplinary tone. It was an official invitation to attend the school's upcoming honorary scholarship ceremony. In the letter, Grace was named as the student representative for Prescott's ideals of courage and compassion. Typed neatly at the bottom was a final line, nominated by Michael Whitmore. Grace didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She simply placed the letter beside the medal. Two symbols from two different worlds, one from a life shaped by sacrifice, the other from a system shaped by privilege. And yet now, they sat side by side, part of the same story. She, the girl who had once been suspended for helping a stranger, was now to be honored for that same act. And the stranger, the one who had lain bleeding on cold tile, who had once been only a whispered name in the dark, had found the quietest, most profound way to say thank you, not with roses or speeches, but by using his name, his influence, and finally, his truth. On the old wooden table in their small apartment, the medal lay without gleam or flourish. But in Grace's eyes, it had never shone brighter, not because of its history, but because it had returned to the hands of someone who knew its worth. And for her, that meant more than any award, more than any applause. It meant she had been right to choose what was right, that even in a world divided by wealth, status, and names carved into stone walls, kindness still held its place steady and immovable, like a medal resting quietly on a table, bridging two generations who never met but carried the same heart. Ever since the medal came home, something in the air within Grace's small apartment had shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, a peace that settled like morning light after a long storm. She and her mother had weathered something profound, and now, without words, they were simply learning to breathe again. But the change wasn't confined to that apartment. Prescott itself was beginning to shift, quietly but unmistakably. Word spread quickly that the Whitmore Corporation was now officially the university's primary benefactor. Yet what truly turned heads wasn't the staggering investment or the scope of the new construction plans. It was a personnel announcement, an unprecedented decision in the school's long and polished history. At a press conference, held in the main auditorium, with President Mitchell and several board members seated behind the podium, Martin Whitmore stepped forward, holding the microphone with the same calm authority that always seemed to quiet a room. He began by announcing the formation of a special administrative division dedicated to supporting underprivileged students, not just with scholarships, but with employment opportunities, counseling, and skills training. Then he made the unexpected move. He named the person he had chosen to oversee the entire program, Mrs. Karen Nolan. The room fell into stunned silence. No one could have imagined that the woman who once mopped the floors of Prescott's dormitories would become one of the cornerstones in its rebuilding. But when Karen walked slowly up the stage steps, her hands trembling around the pages of her speech, her eyes locking on her daughter seated in the front row, it all made sense. She hadn't been chosen out of pity, nor as a gesture of charity. She had been chosen because she understood better than anyone what it meant to struggle, to persevere without recognition, to hold fast to quiet dignity. Her speech was simple, unpolished, spoken in the voice of someone who had lived every word. She spoke of coming to Prescott with calloused hands and worn shoes, of watching her daughter be admitted into a school she herself had only ever dared to admire from a distance. She spoke of seeing students each day, not as numbers or transcripts, but as young people, tired, overwhelmed, sometimes lost, and how sometimes all they needed was someone to ask if they were okay without judging them for the answer. And finally, she said that if Prescott was truly committed to building from the ground up, then it needed to start not with stone, but with people. The room rose in applause. Grace sat motionless in her seat, tears spilling down her cheeks freely, unashamed. For the first time in her life, she saw her mother as the world. Saw her now not in a faded work uniform, not as a shadow in the background, but as a woman of strength, of heart, of unwavering grace. From that day on, everything changed. Karen began holding meetings with the student support teams. She worked alongside counselors, financial directors, and student representatives, no longer sweeping halls, but helping chart new paths for those just beginning theirs. And Grace, still attending classes as usual, would smile quietly every time she passed the newly renovated administrative wing, where her mother's name now appeared on the staff directory. It wasn't just a personal triumph. It was proof that those once deemed invisible could help shape what came next. One late afternoon, as the two of them walked home together along a tree-lined street still glowing with the amber of early autumn, Karen spoke without looking over. "Your father wouldn't believe any of this," she said softly. "If he were alive to see today." Grace squeezed her mother's hand gently and replied, "If Grandpa were here, he'd say you're doing exactly what you taught me to do. He'd be proud, Mum, of both of us." Because we didn't turn away. Under the deepening sky, their shadows stretched long across the pavement. They walked without hurry, without need to hide. They had come through loss and judgment, through fear and silence, and now, side by side, they were helping to lay down a new foundation, not with power or prestige, but with quiet, unwavering belief that every person matters, if someone will only take the time to see it. And that, more than any building of steel and stone, would be the legacy worth leaving behind. Just 1 week after the ceremony announcing the new student support program, Grace received a letter unlike any she had seen before. It was not mass-produced, nor was it a generic congratulatory card. The paper was thick and crisp, the printed text sharp and elegant, with every line carefully spaced and precisely aligned. Inside was an official invitation to join a global health initiative designed specifically for outstanding first-year students, a 3-month program taking place over the upcoming summer break. The program would unfold across 3 developing nations, where teams of volunteers would support community healthcare efforts, work alongside local doctors, and more importantly, undergo hands-on training in conditions that were as harsh as they were profoundly human. When Grace reached the final lines, which stated she had been personally nominated by Michael Whitmore, her heart sank just a little. Not from surprise, but from that familiar ache that came when he did something quietly, yet deeply meaningful. She walked into the kitchen holding the letter, where her mother was preparing dinner. Karen looked at her daughter's face, a mix of concern and anticipation in her eyes. After reading the letter, she put the knife down, turned around, and wrapped her arms around Grace tightly. Her voice was soft but steady. "I know you're going. You have to go. The world is out there waiting for you." Grace said nothing. She leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, soaking in the warmth, knowing without a doubt that she would never have made it here without this woman's strength behind her. That summer began unlike any summer she had known. A long flight carried her and 15 other students to a small village in Central America. There was no steady phone signal, no air conditioning, no supermarkets, no coffee shops. But there were people with gentle smiles, children running barefoot across sun-baked yards, and families who welcomed them like long-lost relatives. Grace was assigned to a makeshift clinic that saw dozens of patients each day from faraway regions. She learned to take blood pressure manually, to mix antibiotics by the glow of an oil lamp, and to dress the wounds of children who had fallen from trees while picking fruit. These tasks, small on the surface, filled her with a sense of purpose she had never quite known before. On some nights, after long, exhausting days, she would sit at a weathered wooden table under dim light and write in her journal. She wrote about an elderly woman who walked nearly 10 kilometers for a handful of painkillers to ease her arthritis, about a little girl with a high fever whom Grace tended to for 3 straight hours until her temperature fell, and about the radiant grin of a 10-year-old boy during his very first dental checkup. Each story left her still and quiet, understanding at last why some people called this a purposeful summer. Because not every place needs grand inventions or eloquent speeches. Sometimes, simply listening to an old man's stories or holding the hand of someone who is afraid is enough to make a difference in the world. During a layover in a major airport, Grace saw a massive billboard from the Whitmore Foundation hanging above the terminal lounge. It showed young volunteers in the heart of a lush jungle, their eyes lit with hope. And in that fleeting moment, she understood that Danny was never just the heir to a fortune. He was inheriting a responsibility. And somehow, in his quiet way, he had chosen her to walk a part of that journey with him. When Grace returned to Prescott, her skin was darker from the sun. Her hands bore a few small scratches, but her eyes shone with an unmistakable light. She brought back countless stories, a notebook filled cover to cover, and a heart that now understood life was not measured in grades or accolades, but in those moments when we truly touch another person's life. Her mother embraced her on the day she came home, tears rolling down her cheeks, but they were tears of pride. Grace spoke only once, softly. "I think I finally understand why Grandpa always believed in kindness, because it really can change the world. And I've seen it with my own eyes. There was no need for further explanation, no need for gratitude, only the resolve to keep going, to keep giving, and to keep believing." One short summer, yet it was enough for her to know exactly how she wanted to live the rest of her life. Not just to study for exams or work to survive, but to give in order to exist meaningfully. And that was the real gift from the billionaire's son, the one who had quietly led her towards something far greater than any scholarship could promise. Grace returned to Prescott in the waning days of summer, when the trees had just begun their slow turn toward amber and gold, and the campus shimmered in a gentle, honeyed light. Everything appeared unchanged, but for her, the world no longer looked the same. She walked through the familiar grounds with a quiet steadiness, not because others noticed her now or because of the respectful glances that followed her summer journey, but because something within her had shifted. She had seen too much in places no one looked, had touched, stories never printed in textbooks, and because of that, she was no longer the girl who once huddled quietly in a hallway, waiting for her mother's shift to end. A few days after the semester resumed, on a late afternoon when the sun cast long, slanted rays through the library trees, she received a brief message. "If you're free, I'm behind the political science building. There's something I'd like to give you." It was from Danny, or Michael. Though she no longer confused the names, it was the first one that her heart always answered to. She tucked her phone away, unhurried, yet without hesitation. When she arrived, he was sitting on an old wooden bench, a carefully clipped packet of papers in his hands. The last light of the day turned his hair a deep burnished gold, but what made her stop in her tracks was not his appearance. It was the tension etched plainly across his face as he looked up to meet her eyes. He stood, silent for a moment, then spoke. "I heard about your trip. Sounds like you found something bigger than Prescott." Grace smiled. "I think what I found wasn't anywhere out there. It was in me. But there's still something I haven't figured out. Why did you disappear again, all summer long?" Danny lowered his head, then looked up, meeting her gaze squarely. "I wanted to give you space. You deserved that time, without being tied to the past or to anyone. I knew if I stayed close, you'd be thinking about everything left unresolved between us. And I didn't want to stand in the way of the light you were stepping into." She looked at him for a long time, her heart heavy. "I don't need someone to lead me, but I also don't want someone who disappears without a word." He nodded, exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry, truly sorry, for the first time, and for the most recent. I carry more scars than you think, not just on my shoulder, but the kind I grew up with. Trusting people is something I've had to relearn from the beginning, and you were the first to teach me how." He handed her the packet. "This is the plan to expand the volunteer program into Southeast Asia. I've put your name down as the lead student ambassador for the new volunteer corps. You won't just be following orders anymore. You'll be mentoring the new recruits, not because I owe you anything, but because I believe you're the one who can carry that light to even more places." Grace took the folder, but didn't open it right away. Instead, she asked, "And what about you? Will you be coming too?" Danny smiled softly, and for the first time in months, it was a smile that didn't hide anything. "If you'll have me, I don't want to walk behind you. I want to walk beside you. Not as an heir to anything, just as someone trying to learn how to live honestly." She didn't speak. A gentle wind passed through, lifting a few strands of hair across her forehead. In that moment, beneath a sky glowing with the fire of the setting sun, she realized that what stirred her heart wasn't what Danny had once hidden, but what he now dared to reveal when there was nothing left to shield him. She nodded. Not quickly, not with promises about the distant future. Just a quiet, steady nod that said, "This is where we begin again." Danny sat back down on the stone bench, patting the space beside him. Grace stepped forward and joined him. They said nothing more. Nothing needed to be said. In the silence, two people from once distant worlds were learning how to move in rhythm together. No music, no fireworks. Just hearts open enough to forgive and strong enough to move forward. The girl who once saved a boy in the rain, and the boy who once hid his whole self behind a borrowed name. Now they were only Grace and Danny. Two souls who had known pain and now chose, together, to write whatever came next. 1 week after that quiet conversation on the stone bench behind the political science building on a crisp autumn morning, Grace found a small envelope placed gently outside her dormitory door. There was no name, no return address, only a single line written in the unmistakable handwriting she had recognized once before, the same script from a note she had read in another lifetime. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of something far deeper. It's time for it to return to where it truly belongs. Inside was a deep, navy velvet box. When she opened it, her breath caught. Resting quietly inside was an authentic purple heart, with its violet ribbon and the raised profile of George Washington shining as if untouched by time or loss. This was not the replica she and her mother had once received from Martin. This was the original. The very medal her grandfather had once parted with in the hardest of times, selling it quietly so his family could get through another month, another winter, another unseen burden. Grace sat still for a long time, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the object that had once symbolized a man's youth and pride, a man she had loved beyond words. She didn't cry, but deep inside, a quiet tide was rising. Not sorrow, but a reverence so full and overwhelming that it stole her breath. She didn't need to ask. She knew Danny had done this. Only he would have understood the meaning of this medal, not just for her mother or for the weight of history it carried, but for Grace herself, the girl who once picked it up off the floor in a moment of desperation, clutching it like an anchor in a storm. That afternoon, she called him, and they agreed to meet in the place where everything seemed to have first begun. The old gym, the room that had once been pitch dark on a rain-soaked night, the place where she had found him lying motionless in a pool of his own blood. Now, daylight streamed through the tall windows. Dust floated in the air, and the silence felt almost sacred. Danny was already there, standing quietly in a simple jacket, his face open, unguarded in a way it never used to be. Grace said nothing. She walked toward him, opened her hand, and showed him the medal. He looked at it, then looked at her. He said nothing either. She spoke first, her voice calm but deep with feeling. "I didn't need you to do this, but I know it must have taken a lot to find it." Danny nodded. "I think if your grandfather was still here, he'd want it in the hands of someone who truly understood its worth. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because I've never forgotten the look in your eyes when you spoke about him. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Grace closed her fingers gently around the medal. "I used to think it only symbolized the past, but now I see it as a bridge between generations, between values that never go out of style, courage, integrity, and compassion." Danny stepped closer, neither rushed nor hesitant. "You've taught me so much, Grace, about what it means to live without hiding, about how to stay true to yourself even when everything else is falling apart. And you," she said, meeting his gaze, "taught me that sometimes the people who seem to have everything are the ones most in need of a place to simply be themselves, and I'm glad you chose to come back. Not as Michael, but as who you really are." In that moment, standing in a room flooded with soft light and thick with memory, the medal rested quietly in her hand like a silent witness. A reminder of sacrifices made without recognition, of kindness that asked for nothing in return, and of one simple truth, that doing the right thing, even when it costs you, is always worth it. They left the room without promises, without labels for whatever this was becoming. But in their eyes, understanding had taken the place of explanation. Between them was more than the memory of a rainy night. There was a future beginning to form, built on something as seemingly small and as powerful as this, a girl who chose not to walk past, a boy who learned to live without masks, and a medal that no longer stood for war or glory, but for goodness given and returned, just in time, to the place it was always meant to be. That evening, after their meeting in the old gym, Grace returned to her dorm with a lightness in her chest, as if some long-held weight had finally lifted, or perhaps as if a door that once creaked with hesitation had gently closed behind her, leaving room for another path to open ahead. There was no fanfare, no dramatic farewell, no promises sworn under the stars. Just a quiet certainty that she no longer had to walk forward alone. When she placed the Purple Heart on the table beside her bed, right next to the framed photograph of her grandfather and the invitation letter from the Whitmore Foundation, Grace suddenly understood something. The very things that once frightened her, that once made her feel small and alone, had now become her strength. She was no longer the girl who had to shrink because of where she came from, nor did she feel the need to prove herself to anyone. She knew her worth, and for the first time in her life, she felt free. The next morning, a message from Danny lit up her phone screen. It was simple. Just an invitation to dinner. Not at a fancy restaurant, not with fanfare. Just a small diner in town, the kind of place students frequented on weekends. But to Grace, it was more than a dinner. It was a sign that after everything, Danny was ready to step into her life, not as the heir to the Whitmore name, but as a young man learning to begin again. She said yes. That evening, when Danny stood waiting outside the diner, dressed in a plain button-down shirt, his smile easy and unguarded when he saw her, Grace found herself smiling back without effort. They chose a table near the window, ordered 2 burgers and a glass of iced tea each. There were no fine linens, no ambient lighting, just the hum of conversation from nearby tables and the soft breeze drifting through the open window. Danny told her about his work at the foundation, about how he and his father were rebuilding a more transparent and fair system of student funding across the country. He said that what happened with Grace had opened his eyes to the reality that injustice doesn't always lie in the rules themselves, but in how people choose to apply them and to whom. Grace shared stories of the children she cared for in distant villages, of their grateful eyes, and of how, for the first time, she understood that kindness could be passed from one person to another, needing neither name nor status to matter. They did not avoid the past. When the conversation touched the memory of that night in the gym, both of them grew quiet. It was Danny who finally broke the silence. "If you had walked past that night, I think I would be someone completely different now." Grace looked at him, her voice as soft as wind brushing through leaves. "And if you hadn't been, to yourself, I don't think I would have ever truly learned what it means to forgive." A nod between them said what words could not. No more distance, no more lingering wounds. Only 2 people learning how to move forward, together. When they left the diner, Danny walked her back to the dormitory gate. There was no goodbye kiss, no hand held too tightly, just a long look, quiet but steady, the kind of gaze that says, even if tomorrow is uncertain, we are ready for it. As Grace made her way back to her room, she glanced up at the night sky, where stars sparkled against the deep velvet of the heavens. She did not know where the future would take her and Danny, but she knew this much. No matter how far the journey stretched, no matter how many times they had to begin again, the road they were now walking together was no longer a solitary one. In every life, there are moments so small, so seemingly ordinary, that they slip by unnoticed, yet carry within them the quiet power to change everything. For Grace, that moment was the simple choice not to turn away, and for Danny, it was learning to let go of the name he once hid behind in order to hold on to the girl who had seen the truth of who he was. They made no promises of forever, but they chose to face the future side by side. Whatever that future might be, the most important part had already begun. Once again, not through status or power, but through trust. Trust that goodness still exists, that love can heal, and that sometimes, just once, not walking past, is enough to change everything. That weekend, Grace returned home to visit her mother. The little town was as peaceful as ever, but this time there was something quieter and deeper stirring inside her. After a simple dinner, she stepped into the living room, where her grandfather's photo still sat proudly on the wooden table beside the chair he used to occupy every evening with a folded newspaper in his hands. Under the warm glow of the lamp, Grace sat down and looked long at the photo. His face remained unchanged, steady, calm, and with eyes that seemed to see straight through time itself. She opened her palm and gently placed the Purple Heart medal on the table, right in front of the frame. A breeze moved through the cracked window, rustling the curtain ever so softly. Grace whispered, almost to herself, but also to him, "I kept my promise. I didn't walk past. And I've learned that doing what's right doesn't always bring rewards right away, but it always brings peace." She smiled softly, her eyes misting, then looked up. "Head up, Grandpa. You can be proud now. Out there, the world keeps shifting and turning. But it's the enduring values, compassion, resilience, and belief in one another that helped an ordinary girl like Grace become someone who didn't just change her own fate, but the lives of those around her as well." Through Grace and Danny's journey, we are reminded that kindness is never wasted, that sometimes a single act, a single moment of not turning away, holds the power to change a life. And we learn, too, that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing to move forward without letting old pain lock away the heart. Their story is a gentle reminder that behind every person is a story we haven't heard. And only when we stop, listen, and truly see one another can we begin to understand and to love honestly. And now, what about you? After hearing their story, what part touched your heart the most? Have you ever stood at a crossroads, choosing between protecting yourself and reaching out to someone in need? Have you ever met someone who changed the way you see the world? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below, because every story from the heart has the power to move. Don't forget to subscribe to Emotional Echoes, like this video, and share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful, heartfelt stories to life, stories that touch the soul and inspire a kinder, more connected world. We truly look forward to hearing your reflections, because we believe emotions are what bring us closer, regardless of age, background, or belief. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We wish you good health, joy in each day, peace in every moment, and the unshakable belief in the quiet power of doing good. Until next time, from all of us here at Emotional Echoes, goodbye, and take gentle care.